Welcome to the Spirituality in Society podcast. In this episode of the Spirituality in Society podcast, we will be exploring the complex and intertwined history of Western technology, Hellenization, Christianization, colonization, and decolonization in Africa, as well as the persistence of neocolonialism in the continent today. We will begin by discussing the impact of Western technology on African societies, including the ways in which European colonizers introduced new technologies and infrastructures to Africa, as well as the ongoing challenges that many African countries face in terms of access to basic technologies. Next, we will delve into the history of Hellenization in Africa, exploring how Greek culture and language spread through contact and exchange with African societies, and how this influenced African art, literature, philosophy, and religion. We will then turn our attention to the spread of Christianity in Africa, including the connection between Christianization and European colonization, and the lasting impact that Christianity has had on African cultures and identities. Finally, we will examine the ongoing challenges of decolonization in Africa, including the inconsistent progress of decolonization movements and the persistence of neocolonialism in the continent today. Join us as we explore these complex and interconnected topics, and delve into the rich history of spirituality in Africa. Western technology has had a significant impact on African societies, both historically and in the present day. European colonizers introduced new technologies and infrastructures to Africa during the colonial period, such as firearms, railways, telegraphs, and automobiles, that transformed African societies in various ways. These technologies facilitated the exploitation of African resources and labor, but also enabled the growth of colonial economies and the emergence of new industries. However, the legacy of colonialism also left many African countries with significant infrastructure deficits and limited access to basic technologies. This has perpetuated inequalities and hindered development in many parts of the continent. Today, many African countries still face significant challenges in terms of access to electricity, telecommunications, and the internet, particularly in rural and low-income areas. Moreover, the uneven distribution of technology in Africa has led to new forms of inequality and marginalization. For example, the digital divide has widened between Africa and other parts of the world, with many African countries lagging behind in terms of internet access and digital literacy. This has limited the potential for innovation and economic growth, as well as hindered access to education, healthcare, and other essential services. As African countries continue to work towards decolonization and development, addressing the challenges of technology access and infrastructure deficits will be critical to achieving more equitable and sustainable growth. This will require significant investment in technology and infrastructure, as well as addressing the structural barriers and power imbalances that perpetuate inequality and marginalization in many parts of the continent. But there are several advantages to Western technologies that have been introduced to African societies. These include improved infrastructure. Western technologies, such as railways, roads, and bridges, have helped to improve transportation and connectivity in many African countries. This has made it easier to move people, goods, and resources across long distances. Increased productivity. Western technologies have also helped to increase productivity in many African industries, such as agriculture and manufacturing. For example, modern farming equipment and techniques have enabled farmers to produce more food with less labor. Improved healthcare. Western medical technologies, such as vaccines, antibiotics, and medical equipment, have improved healthcare outcomes in many African countries, reducing mortality rates from infectious diseases and improving overall health. Enhanced communication. The internet, mobile phones, and other digital technologies have helped to improve communication and connectivity in many African countries. This has enabled greater access to information and improved opportunities for education and business. Overall, Western technologies have the potential to improve the quality of life and spur economic growth in African societies. However, access to these technologies is not evenly distributed, and many African countries still face significant challenges in terms of infrastructure, education, and resources, which can limit the benefits of Western technologies for certain populations. Western technologies also deserve decolonization? It's important to distinguish between the technology itself and the systems of power and oppression that often accompany it. Western technologies, like any technology, are not inherently good or bad. They can be used for positive or negative purposes depending on the context and the people using them. However, the ways in which Western technologies have been historically introduced and implemented in African societies have often been tied to colonialism and neocolonialism, which can perpetuate unequal power dynamics and harm local communities. So, the question of whether Western technologies deserve decolonization is a complex one that depends on the specific context and the ways in which the technology is being used and implemented. It's important to consider the historical and social context in which these technologies are introduced and to ensure that they are being used in ways that benefit and empower local communities rather than perpetuating existing power imbalances. Only Christianity that deserve decolonization? It is important to acknowledge the ways in which Christianity was used as a tool of colonialism and oppression in many parts of the world, including Africa. Missionaries often acted as agents of European colonizers, promoting Western values and beliefs while suppressing or erasing traditional cultural practices and spiritualities. However, it is also important to recognize that Christianity, like any religion, is not inherently colonialist or oppressive. Many people around the world, including in Africa, have found meaning, comfort, and community in Christian faith. Furthermore, many African communities have incorporated Christian beliefs and practices into their own unique cultural traditions, creating hybrid spiritualities that reflect the complex histories and identities of African peoples. Decolonization of Christianity does not necessarily mean rejecting the faith altogether, but rather examining and challenging the ways in which it has been used as a tool of oppression and promoting a more inclusive and culturally sensitive approach to Christian practice and theology. Definition of decolonization of the African mind. Decolonization of the African mind refers to a process of unlearning the effects of colonization on African cultures, identities, and ways of thinking. This involves examining and challenging the assumptions, values, and attitudes that were imposed on Africans during the period of colonization and reclaiming African cultural practices and identities that were suppressed during the colonial era. The goal of decolonization is to empower African people to assert their own identities and narratives, and to create a more equitable and just world. Effects of colonization on African cultures, identities, and ways of thinking. The effects of colonization on African cultures, identities, and ways of thinking have been profound and far-reaching. Here are a few examples. Loss of cultural identity. Many African cultures suffered significant damage during colonization, as the colonizers sought to impose their own values, customs, and beliefs on the colonized peoples. This often involved the suppression of African languages, religions, and cultural practices, leading to a loss of cultural identity for many Africans. Disruption of traditional societies. Many African societies were disrupted and destroyed by colonialism, as traditional social structures were uprooted and replaced by new systems of governance and administration. This led to a breakdown of traditional relationships, customs, and ways of life. Economic exploitation. African resources were often extracted for the benefit of the colonizers, leading to economic exploitation and impoverishment of many African communities. This created a legacy of poverty and underdevelopment that persists to this day. Racism and discrimination. The legacy of colonialism has contributed to systemic racism and discrimination against Africans, both within and outside of Africa. This has led to unequal opportunities and outcomes for African people in areas such as education, employment, and access to healthcare. Psychological effects. The experience of colonization has had a profound psychological impact on many Africans, contributing to feelings of inferiority, self-doubt, and a lack of self-esteem. This has led to a struggle to reclaim African identity and to assert African values, customs, and beliefs in the face of ongoing colonial legacies and systems of power. In summary, colonization had a devastating impact on African cultures, identities, and ways of thinking, and continues to be felt to this day. The process of decolonization involves challenging and dismantling the legacies of colonialism and reclaiming African identity and values. The importance of decolonization in empowering African people and creating a more just world. Decolonization is crucial in empowering African people and creating a more just world. It is essential to recognize that the impact of colonization on African societies and cultures has been far-reaching and long-lasting. Decolonization aims to reverse the damage done by colonialism and restore agency and autonomy to African people. One of the main ways that decolonization can empower African people is by restoring their sense of identity and cultural heritage. During the colonial period, African cultures were often suppressed, and traditional ways of life were replaced with European values and norms. Decolonization can help African people to reconnect with their roots and reclaim their cultural heritage. In addition to cultural restoration, decolonization can also lead to greater economic and political empowerment for African people. Many African nations continue to struggle with poverty and underdevelopment, which can be traced back to the legacy of colonialism. Decolonization can help African countries to establish their own economies and governance systems, rather than relying on former colonial powers. Furthermore, decolonization can help to create a more just world by addressing the structural inequalities and power imbalances that continue to exist between the global North and the global South. Colonialism was built on the exploitation and domination of colonized peoples, and the legacy of this system persists in many aspects of international relations today. Decolonization can help to dismantle these structures of oppression and create a more equitable global community. In short, decolonization is important in empowering African people by restoring their cultural identity and heritage, promoting economic and political autonomy, and addressing structural inequalities in the global community. By embracing decolonization, we can work towards a more just and equitable world for all. Hellenization's technology and colonization's technology in African continent. Hellenization's technology and colonization's technology are two different concepts that have impacted the African continent in different ways. Hellenization technology refers to the spread of Greek language, culture, and ideas throughout the ancient world, including parts of Africa. This was largely due to the conquests of Alexander the Great, who established Greek-speaking kingdoms in Egypt and parts of North Africa. Hellenization technology influenced African cultures through the adoption of Greek language, philosophy, and art, and helped to spread ideas about science and medicine. On the other hand, colonization technology refers to the tools, strategies, and technologies that were used by European powers to colonize Africa in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This included military technology such as guns and cannons, transportation technology such as railroads and steamships, and communication technology such as telegraphs and radios. Colonization technology was used to subjugate African peoples and extract resources for European powers. While Hellenization technology had a more indirect impact on African cultures, colonization technology had a direct and devastating effect on the continent. The use of colonization technology led to the exploitation of African resources, the destruction of traditional African economies and societies, and the imposition of European values and systems of government. Decolonization efforts seek to undo these effects and empower African peoples to reclaim their cultures and identities. The timeline of Western technology in the African continent spans several centuries and includes a wide range of technological innovations and developments. Here are some key events and milestones. 15th century, Portuguese explorers, led by Vasco da Gama, reached the African coast and established trading posts along the way. This marks the beginning of European contact with Africa. 16th to 17th centuries, European powers, particularly the Portuguese, Dutch, and British, established colonial rule in various parts of Africa. They introduced Western technologies, such as firearms, navigation instruments, and shipbuilding techniques, to African societies. 19th century, the Industrial Revolution in Europe leads to significant advancements in technology, particularly in transportation, communication, and manufacturing. European colonizers introduced new technologies, such as railways, telegraphs, and steam engines, to Africa. Late 19th, early 20th century, European colonizers continued to introduce new technologies to Africa, including electricity, automobiles, and airplanes. Many African societies began to adopt these technologies, but often face significant challenges in terms of infrastructure, education, and resources. Mid-20th century, following World War II, many African countries gained independence from European colonizers. The newly independent African nations seek to modernize and develop their economies, often with the help of Western aid and technology transfers. Late 20th, early 21st century, with the advent of the digital age, African countries begin to adopt new technologies, such as mobile phones, computers, and the internet. However, access to these technologies remains uneven across the continent, with many rural and low-income areas still lacking access to basic technologies. Overall, the timeline of Western technology in Africa reflects the complex and often fraught history of European colonization and African development, as well as the ongoing challenges and opportunities facing African societies in the modern era. The decolonization movement in Africa has been inconsistent in its approach to Western technology. On one hand, there has been a push to reclaim and celebrate traditional African knowledge and technologies, and to promote self-sufficiency and sustainability. This has led to initiatives such as promoting indigenous agricultural practices, building community-owned renewable energy systems, and developing local manufacturing industries. On the other hand, many African countries continue to rely heavily on Western technologies and expertise for development, often with the support of foreign aid and investment. This has led to a situation where African societies are heavily dependent on imported goods and technologies, often at the expense of local industries and knowledge systems. Additionally, the transfer of technology from the West to Africa has often been uneven and exploitative, with many African countries lacking the resources and infrastructure to fully integrate and utilize new technologies. Moreover, some argue that the decolonization movement has not done enough to address the underlying power imbalances and structural inequalities that continue to shape the relationship between Africa and the West. For instance, the continued dominance of Western companies and institutions in shaping global technological standards and policies can perpetuate the marginalization of African voices and interests. Overall, the inconsistency of the decolonization movement in Africa with regard to Western technology reflects the complex and ongoing challenges facing African societies as they seek to navigate the legacies of colonialism and chart a path towards self-determination and sustainable development. Hellenization in Africa. Hellenization refers to the spread and influence of ancient Greek culture, language, and traditions. Hellenization refers to the spread of Greek culture and influence in ancient times, particularly during the Hellenistic period, 323 BCE to 31 BCE, following the conquests of Alexander the Great. While the term is not typically used to describe more recent events in Africa, there are some examples of Hellenization in African history. One notable example is the city of Alexandria in Egypt, which was founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE and became a center of Greek culture and learning in the ancient world. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt from 305 BCE to 30 BCE, Alexandria continued to be a major hub of Hellenistic culture and scholarship, with the famous Library of Alexandria housing thousands of books and attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean world. Another example of Hellenization in Africa is the spread of Christianity, which was initially spread by Greek-speaking missionaries in the early centuries CE. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, Greek culture and language played an important role in shaping the development of the religion, particularly in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Overall, while Hellenization is not typically used to describe more recent events in Africa, there are examples of Greek culture and influence in ancient African history, particularly in Egypt and the spread of Christianity. Influence of Greek culture and language on African societies. The influence of Greek culture and language on African societies is primarily associated with the period of ancient Greek colonization in North Africa, which began in the 7th century BCE and lasted for several centuries. During this time, Greek colonists established settlements and trading posts along the North African coast, particularly in areas that are now modern-day Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria. These Greek colonies became centers of trade, cultural exchange, and intellectual activity, and had a significant impact on the development of local African cultures. One of the most important legacies of Greek colonization was the spread of Greek language and literature in North Africa. Greek became the language of trade, scholarship, and diplomacy in many of the coastal cities, and was adopted by many African elites as a second language. Greek literature, philosophy, and science were also studied and translated into local languages, contributing to the development of new intellectual traditions. Greek influence on African art and architecture is also evident in the surviving archaeological remains of ancient North African cities, such as Cyrene and Leptis Magna in Libya, and Carthage in Tunisia. These cities were built in the Greek style, with public buildings, temples, and theaters that imitated the architecture of ancient Greece. In addition to these cultural and linguistic influences, Greek colonization also had a significant impact on North African trade and economics. The Greek colonies established extensive networks of trade, both with other Mediterranean powers and with African kingdoms and city-states. This trade brought new goods and technologies to North Africa and facilitated the exchange of ideas and cultures. Overall, the influence of Greek culture and language on African societies was significant and enduring, and contributed to the development of new cultural, intellectual, and economic traditions in North Africa. Impact of Hellenistic culture on African art, literature, philosophy, and religion. The impact of Hellenistic culture on African art, literature, philosophy, and religion was significant and complex. Art. The Hellenistic period brought new artistic styles and techniques to Africa, which were blended with local African styles to create unique hybrid forms. For example, the influence of Greek art can be seen in the depictions of Egyptian pharaohs wearing Greek-style clothing and hairstyles. The blending of Greek and African artistic styles can also be seen in the creation of mosaics and frescoes in North Africa. Literature. The spread of Greek language and culture in Africa led to the translation of Greek literature into African languages, which resulted in the creation of new literary forms. African writers began to adopt Greek literary genres, such as tragedy and epic poetry, and incorporate them into their own works. This fusion of Greek and African literary traditions can be seen in the works of Apollonius of Rhodes, who wrote the epic poem Argonautica, which tells the story of Jason and the Argonauts. Philosophy. The influence of Hellenistic philosophy on African thought is evident in the writings of African philosophers such as Philo of Alexandria, who blended Greek philosophy with Jewish theology to create a new philosophical system. The fusion of Greek and African philosophical traditions can also be seen in the works of Plotinus, a philosopher who was born in Egypt and studied in Athens, who developed a philosophical system known as Neoplatonism. Religion. The spread of Greek culture in Africa also had a significant impact on religion. The blending of Greek and African religious traditions can be seen in the development of the cult of Isis, which was a popular religion in the Hellenistic world and was adopted by many African societies. The influence of Hellenistic religion can also be seen in the worship of Serapis, a god who was a blend of the Greek god Zeus and the Egyptian god Osiris. Overall, the impact of Hellenistic culture on African art, literature, philosophy, and religion was significant and complex, leading to the creation of new hybrid forms that blended Greek and African traditions. The reciprocal influence of African cultures on Greek culture. There are several examples of reciprocal influence between African cultures and Greek culture during the Hellenistic period. One of the most well-known examples is the influence of Egyptian religion on Greek religion. Many Greek gods and goddesses were identified with their Egyptian counterparts, and some were even worshipped in both cultures. For example, the god Ammonius was identified with Zeus, and the goddess Isis was identified with Demeter. This influence can also be seen in the construction of temples and religious practices, such as the use of processions and animal sacrifices. African cultures also influenced Greek art during the Hellenistic period. For example, the Greek artist Praxiteles was heavily influenced by the art of the African kingdom of Pergamum. He incorporated African techniques such as chiaroscuro, the use of light and shadow to create depth and volume, into his sculptures. African motifs and designs were also incorporated into Greek pottery and textiles. Additionally, African philosophy and science had an impact on Greek thought during the Hellenistic period. Greek philosophers such as Aristotle and Pythagoras were heavily influenced by African ideas about mathematics, astronomy, and metaphysics. The philosopher Thales is said to have been influenced by Egyptian mathematics and philosophy, and the mathematician Euclid was heavily influenced by African mathematics. Overall, the reciprocal influence between African cultures and Greek culture during the Hellenistic period highlights the complex and dynamic nature of cultural exchange and the ways in which different cultures can learn from and inspire one another. Comparison of Hellenization, Christianization, and colonization in Africa. Hellenization, Christianization, and colonization are three different historical processes that have influenced African societies in different ways. Hellenization refers to the spread of Greek culture and language in the ancient world, including Africa, through the conquests of Alexander the Great and the subsequent establishment of Greek kingdoms and colonies. Hellenization had a significant impact on African societies, particularly in Egypt and North Africa, where Greek culture was assimilated into local traditions and gave rise to new artistic, philosophical, and religious expressions. Christianization, on the other hand, refers to the spread of Christianity, particularly through the efforts of European missionaries during the colonial period. Christianity had a profound impact on African societies, often leading to the displacement or suppression of traditional African religions and the adoption of European cultural values and practices. However, Christianity also provided a source of resistance and empowerment for many Africans, as they used Christian teachings to challenge colonial rule and assert their own identities and rights. Colonization, meanwhile, refers to the establishment of European political and economic control over African territories, often accompanied by the imposition of Western cultural values and practices. Colonization had a devastating impact on African societies, leading to the forced labor, displacement, and exploitation of millions of Africans. It also led to the suppression of local cultures and languages, as European powers sought to impose their own language and traditions on African societies. While there are similarities and differences between these historical processes, it is important to recognize that they have all had a significant impact on African societies and have shaped the course of African history. It is also important to acknowledge the ways in which African societies have resisted and adapted to these influences, developing their own unique cultural expressions and traditions in the face of outside pressures. Spread of Greek culture and language through Hellenization. Hellenization refers to the spread of Greek culture, language, and way of life to other regions and peoples beyond Greece. This process began with the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE and continued through the Hellenistic period, which lasted until the Roman conquest of Greece in 146 BCE. Hellenization involved the establishment of Greek colonies and settlements in other regions, the introduction of Greek language and education, and the spread of Greek art, architecture, philosophy, and religion. Greek cities, such as Alexandria in Egypt, became centers of learning and culture, attracting scholars, artists, and merchants from all over the Mediterranean world. The spread of Greek culture through Hellenization had a significant impact on the cultures and societies of the regions that came under Greek influence. For example, in Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled after Alexander's conquest adopted many aspects of Greek culture and language while retaining their own traditions and beliefs. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE, became one of the most important centers of learning in the ancient world and helped to preserve and translate the knowledge and literature of many different cultures. Similarly, in the Middle East and Central Asia, the Greek influence was felt in the art, literature, and religion of the various peoples who came under Greek rule. The spread of Greek language also facilitated the spread of Greek ideas and culture, and helped to create a shared cultural and intellectual tradition throughout the Mediterranean world. Overall, the Hellenization of other regions was a complex and multifaceted process that involved the exchange and blending of different cultures, beliefs, and traditions, and had a lasting impact on the development of Western civilization. Spread of Christianity in Africa and its connection to European colonization. The spread of Christianity in Africa began in the 1st century AD with the arrival of the Ethiopian eunuch, who was baptized by the Apostle Philip. Christianity spread slowly throughout Africa, primarily along the Mediterranean coast and in Ethiopia, but also in other regions such as Nubia, present-day Sudan, and the Kingdom of Aksum, present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. In the 15th century, with the arrival of Portuguese explorers, the spread of Christianity in Africa accelerated. The Portuguese established trading posts along the African coast and brought missionaries to convert African peoples to Christianity. In some cases, the conversion to Christianity was forced, as the Portuguese sought to control African populations and undermine traditional religious practices. During the 19th century, European colonizers, particularly the British and French, continued to spread Christianity throughout Africa, often using it as a tool of colonialism. Missionaries were sent to African colonies to spread Christianity and establish churches, schools, and hospitals. These institutions often served the interests of colonial powers, as they were used to control and influence African populations and undermine traditional cultural practices. The spread of Christianity in Africa has had a complex and often contentious relationship with European colonization. While some African peoples embraced Christianity as a means of resistance and liberation, others saw it as a tool of oppression and cultural imperialism. In the modern era, Christianity continues to be a prominent religion in Africa, with a diverse range of expressions and practices that reflect the continent's rich cultural and religious traditions. The impact of European colonization on African societies and cultures. European colonization had a significant impact on African societies and cultures, both in terms of its immediate effects during the colonial period and its long-term consequences for African development and identity. Here are some of the key impacts. Loss of political and economic sovereignty. European colonizers imposed their own political and economic systems on African societies, often at the expense of indigenous power structures and economic systems. This led to a loss of sovereignty and self-determination for many African nations. Exploitation of resources and labor. European colonizers often exploited African resources and labor for their own economic gain, leading to the extraction of natural resources and the forced labor of African people. Disruption of traditional social and cultural practices. European colonizers often sought to impose their own cultural values and practices on African societies, leading to the suppression of traditional practices and the loss of cultural heritage. Introduction of new technologies and ideas. European colonizers introduced new technologies, such as railways and telegraphs, to Africa, as well as new ideas, such as Christianity and Western-style education. Legacy of division and conflict. European colonization often led to the division of African societies along ethnic, linguistic, and cultural lines, which has contributed to ongoing conflict and instability in many African nations. Overall, the impact of European colonization on Africa has been profound and far-reaching, shaping the course of African history and development in a variety of ways. The lasting effects of these processes on African societies and cultures today. The lasting effects of colonization, Hellenization, and Christianization on African societies and cultures are still present today. The legacy of European colonialism is particularly evident in the political, economic, and social structures of many African countries, which were often established by colonial powers and reflect their interests and priorities rather than those of local populations. This has resulted in ongoing struggles for political autonomy, economic independence, and social justice in many African nations. The impact of Hellenization and Christianization is also visible in the cultural and religious practices of many African societies. While some aspects of traditional African culture and religion have survived and continue to thrive, others were suppressed or displaced by Greek and Christian influences. For example, many traditional African religions were viewed as pagan or idolatrous by Christian missionaries and were actively discouraged or banned. This has contributed to the rise of Christianity as a dominant religion in many African countries, particularly in the colonial and post-colonial eras. Additionally, the spread of Western technology, education, and cultural norms has also had a lasting impact on African societies and cultures. While many African nations have embraced aspects of Western culture and technology as a means of modernization and development, this has often come at the expense of traditional practices and knowledge systems. The effects of globalization and the spread of Western cultural values continue to shape African societies in complex and multifaceted ways, with both positive and negative consequences. Overall, the legacy of colonialism, Hellenization, and Christianization in Africa is complex and multifaceted, and continues to shape the social, cultural, and political landscape of the continent today. While efforts to decolonize and reclaim traditional African knowledge and practices have gained momentum in recent years, there is still much work to be done to address the ongoing impacts of these historical processes. So decolonization of Christianity movement and apostasy can be related in the context of Christianity in a few ways. First, the decolonization of Christianity movement seeks to challenge and undo the legacy of colonialism and imperialism within Christianity. This includes addressing the ways in which Christianity was used as a tool of colonization and oppression in many parts of the world, including Africa, Asia, and the Americas. As part of this process, the movement aims to reclaim the cultural and spiritual traditions of these regions that were suppressed or erased by colonial powers. Apostasy, on the other hand, refers to the act of renouncing one's faith or abandoning one's religious beliefs. In the context of Christianity, apostasy is often seen as a rejection of the teachings of Jesus Christ and the authority of the Church. The relationship between decolonization of Christianity movement and apostasy in the context of Christianity can arise when people from formerly colonized regions reject Christianity as a result of its association with colonialism and imperialism. Some people may view Christianity as a symbol of oppression and cultural erasure, and therefore choose to reject it as part of a broader rejection of colonialism and its legacies. However, it is important to note that not all people who advocate for decolonization of Christianity movement are necessarily apostates, and vice versa. Some people may still choose to identify as Christian while also seeking to challenge the ways in which Christianity has been used to reinforce colonial power structures. Similarly, some people who reject Christianity may do so for reasons that are unrelated to decolonization, or may choose to adopt other spiritual or religious traditions that they feel are more aligned with their cultural heritage. Apostasy refers to the act of renouncing or abandoning one's religious or political beliefs or affiliations. It can involve a complete rejection of one's former beliefs or simply a shift to a different belief system. The term is often used in a religious context to refer to a person who has abandoned their faith, either by converting to a different religion or by rejecting religion altogether. In some religious traditions, apostasy is considered a serious offense and can result in social or legal consequences. In the context of Christianity, apostasy refers to the act of renouncing or abandoning the Christian faith, either by denying one's belief in Jesus Christ or by rejecting the teachings and doctrines of the Christian religion. Apostasy is viewed as a serious sin in Christianity, and those who commit apostasy are often considered to have turned away from God and face the possibility of eternal damnation. In some Christian traditions, apostasy is also associated with heresy, or the propagation of false teachings that are contrary to the established doctrines of the faith. Christianity first arrived in Africa during the Hellenistic period, which spanned from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE to the emergence of the Roman Empire in the 1st century BCE. During this time, the Greek language and culture had a significant impact on various regions of Africa, including Egypt, Ethiopia, and Libya. According to tradition, the Apostle Mark brought Christianity to Egypt in the 1st century CE, and it spread rapidly throughout the region. The Coptic Church, which emerged in Egypt and became one of the oldest Christian churches in the world, was heavily influenced by Greek culture and language during the Hellenistic period. Similarly, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its origins back to the Hellenistic period, when Greek merchants and colonizers brought Christianity to Ethiopia. The church was established as the official religion of the Aksumite kingdom in the 4th century CE and has been an integral part of Ethiopian culture and society ever since. Overall, the presence of Christianity in Africa during the Hellenistic period was shaped by the influence of Greek culture and language, as well as the interactions between African and Greek societies. The early spread of Christianity in Africa laid the foundation for its continued growth and development in the continent, which was further influenced by later waves of colonization and missionary work. Christianity has a long and complex history in Sudan, particularly in the region of Kush, also known as Nubia. According to tradition, Christianity was first introduced to Kush by two disciples of Jesus, Saint Matthew and St. Bartholomew, in the 1st century AD. However, the early Christian presence in Kush was relatively small and limited to a few communities. The spread of Christianity in Kush began in earnest in the 6th century, when the Byzantine Empire sent missionaries to the region. These missionaries established churches and monasteries and began to convert local rulers and elites. By the 7th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion in Kush, and the region was known for its vibrant Christian culture and scholarship. However, the spread of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries brought significant challenges to the Christian communities of Kush. Many Christians were forced to convert to Islam or face persecution and discrimination. Despite these challenges, Christianity continued to survive in Kush, albeit in a much diminished form. In the modern era, Christianity has experienced a resurgence in Sudan, particularly following the secession of South Sudan in 2011. Many of the country's Christians are concentrated in the southern regions of the country, including in the states of South Kordofan and Blue Nile. However, Christians in Sudan continue to face significant challenges, including discrimination and persecution from the Muslim majority. As we conclude this episode, it is clear that the history of Africa is complex and multifaceted, with influences from various cultures and societies over the centuries. The impacts of Hellenization, Christianization, and colonization are still felt today in African societies and cultures, and the ongoing struggle for decolonization continues. It is important to understand and acknowledge this history in order to move forward towards a more just and equitable world. The inconsistencies of the decolonization movement. The decolonization movement is a complex and multifaceted process that seeks to undo the effects of colonialism on colonized societies. One of the inconsistencies of the decolonization movement is the tension between rejecting Western religions and cultures while embracing Western sciences and technology. On one hand, decolonization seeks to reject the imposition of Western cultural and religious values on colonized peoples. This rejection is often rooted in the idea that Western values and religions were used to justify the subjugation and exploitation of colonized peoples. As a result, the decolonization movement seeks to reassert the cultural and religious values of colonized societies as a means of reasserting their autonomy and dignity. On the other hand, many decolonization movements recognize the benefits of Western sciences and technology. In some cases, these technologies can be used to improve the standard of living of colonized peoples, providing them with access to things like clean water, electricity, and medical care. However, the use of Western sciences and technology also raises concerns about neocolonialism, as these technologies are often produced and controlled by Western corporations and governments, perpetuating the same power dynamics that characterized the colonial era. In summary, the inconsistencies of the decolonization movement are rooted in the tension between rejecting the imposition of Western cultural and religious values on colonized societies, while recognizing the benefits of Western sciences and technology. While there are no easy answers to these tensions, decolonization requires a critical engagement with these issues, and a commitment to building a more just and equitable world. Neocolonialism refers to a form of indirect imperialism that involves the exploitation of developing countries by their former colonizers or other foreign powers. In the African context, neocolonialism involves economic and political control by foreign powers over African countries, often disguised as aid, investment, or trade agreements. This can lead to the continuation of unequal power relations between Africa and the rest of the world, as well as the perpetuation of poverty, corruption, and underdevelopment in many African nations. It is important for African leaders and citizens to be aware of neocolonialism and its effects, and to work towards greater self-sufficiency and sovereignty in the economic and political spheres. There are several examples of neocolonialism in Africa. Here are a few. Economic exploitation. Many African countries continue to face economic exploitation by foreign powers and multinational corporations. For example, some African countries are rich in natural resources such as oil, diamonds, and gold, but these resources are often controlled and extracted by foreign companies, with little benefit to the local population. Unequal trade relations. African countries often face unequal trade relations with Western countries, which can further entrench economic exploitation. This can include practices such as tariff barriers, subsidies, and intellectual property rules that favor Western countries over African ones. Political interference. Neocolonialism can also take the form of political interference in African countries. This can include Western countries and organizations using their influence to support certain political leaders or parties, or to undermine democratically elected governments that do not align with Western interests. Cultural domination. Western cultural domination is also a form of neocolonialism in Africa. This can include the spread of Western cultural norms, such as consumerism and individualism, which can erode traditional African cultural values and practices. Debt trap. Many African countries have been trapped in cycles of debt, often owed to Western countries and institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank. These debts can be difficult to repay, and often come with conditions that require the implementation of economic policies that can be harmful to local populations. These examples highlight some of the ways that neocolonialism continues to manifest in Africa, often perpetuating economic and political inequalities that were established during the colonial era. Applications. Understanding the history of African societies and cultures. Learning about the history of African societies and cultures, including the impact of Hellenization, Christianization, and European colonization, can help us better understand the complex and varied histories of African nations and peoples. Promoting decolonization. Understanding the inconsistencies and limitations of the decolonization movement in Africa can help us identify areas where we need to work harder to promote decolonization, both in terms of the legacy of European colonization and the ongoing impact of Western technology and cultural influences. Appreciating the reciprocal influence of cultures. Learning about the reciprocal influence of African and Greek cultures during the Hellenistic period, as well as the impact of African cultures on Christian traditions, can help us appreciate the richness and diversity of cultural exchange and influence throughout history. Understanding the diversity of Christianity in Africa. Understanding the diversity of Christian traditions in Africa, including the history of the Coptic Church in Sudan and other parts of North Africa, can help us appreciate the complexities and nuances of religious traditions in Africa and their ongoing impact on African societies and cultures. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode on the complex and intertwined histories of Hellenization, Christianization, colonization, and decolonization in Africa. We hope that this discussion has shed light on some of the key events and issues related to these processes, as well as their lasting effects on African societies and cultures today. Remember to continue learning and exploring these topics, and to engage in thoughtful and respectful dialogue with others. Thank you again for listening.